here is a king who leaves his entire palace and relocates every year. So this king has to move, and it is compulsory for him and his entire royal household. In fact, when the time comes, the whole royal household starts preparing. People begin making their ways towards the royal residence. Then the king leaves. But where does the king go? And why does the entire royal household have to live with the king? And what happened to the royal residence they leave behind? There is actually a very good reason this happens every year. And to understand it, we have to go back to the place where the king begins his journey. So the place is Lialu in the western Zambia. So this is where the Litunga, the traditional king of the Lozi people, has his royal residence. So every year when the time comes for the king to leave, something unusual starts happening around the palace. People already know what is coming. The royal household begin getting things ready. The atmosphere changes, people start gathering, and then eventually the king leaves. But here is the thing I want you to notice. He's not living alone. His royal household also goes with him. His attendants, his bodyguard, his belongings, member of his court also goes with him. In fact, the journey they are about to make is not anything like a normal trip, because there is another royal residence waiting for them. Now, you are probably wondering, why does this king have to do this every year? Since he already has a palace, he already has a kingdom, so what exactly is going on? So the king doesn't travel the way you might expect a king to travel. There's no long line of cars waiting outside the palace. So there is not modern convoy with royal household. So instead, the journey takes place on water. And waiting for the king is a very unusual royal boat. So it is called the Nalikwanda. Now when I say boat, don't picture a small canoe with two people sitting inside it. No, this boat is huge. It is a long black and white royal barge built for the Litunga and its entourage. So there are people all along it. There are musicians, there are attendants, there are possessions belonging to the royal household, and there are large numbers of paddlers. So for the first time you see this boat moving, you can immediately tell that this is not an ordinary journey. And when you notice what is sitting on top of it, an elephant. Not a real elephant, of course, a large elephant figure. And that elephant represents the Lozi royal power. So with the king somewhere on board and a giant elephant standing above it. Honestly, it is the kind of sight that makes you stop and look twice. And that is the journey we are following. But even the journey has rules. The royal boat doesn't simply have to leave wherever anyone is ready. So first, two white scouts cannot go ahead. They check the route, they check the water, they make sure the way is safe for the royal procession. Then the mage barge follows. And once the paddlers start walking, they have a long day ahead of them. So the trip from Dilialu to Limulinga can take around 6 to 8 hours. So think about that for a moment. That is a long time to keep a huge wooden boat moving. And the paddlers have to work together. They can't just paddle whenever they feel like. So their movements have to stay together, and that is where the royal drums comes in. So the royal drums are called mahuma. So some of the important drums are known as kanona, monanga, and mundili. And these are not new drums brought out simply because there is a ceremony. In fact, Mongo Municipal Council says the drums are believed to be more than 170 years old. So while the paddlers are moving the boat, the sound you are hearing comes from the tradition that has been around for generations. So the paddles move, the drums sound, the boat moves forward, and slowly, almost like a scene from another time, the royal procession leaves Lialu behind. Now, there is something else about the king's journey, and honestly, this is one of the details that caught me completely off guard. The king doesn't wear the same clothes for the entire journey. So he starts in traditional Lozi royal clothing, then later he changed into a British admiral's uniform. A British admiral uniform was presented to Luttinger in 1902 by King Edward VII, and somehow the old uniform became part of his royal journey. But let's get back to the boat, because the king is not the only person making this journey. His wife travels on another royal barge, the prime minister has another boat, other chiefs accompany the Luttinger. So basically, when this royal procession moves, it is not one boat carrying one person, it is a whole group traveling together. And that is exactly why the preparations are so important. There are people to organize, people to pack belongings, there are boats to arrange, there is a route to check, and of course the timing has to be right. So there's even a fire on the Nalikiwanda, and this is another detail that is easy to miss. So the smoke has traditionally been used as a sign that the king is alive and well during the journey. So think about this for a moment. The royal boat is moving across a huge stretch of water. So after a while, people standing far away may not be able to see exactly what is happening on the boat, but they can see the smoke. So they know the king is still there. The procession is still moving, and in a way, that simple column of smoke becomes a message from the boat to the people watching from a distance. And then you look at the elephant again, it is simply sitting there. According to the Mongu Municipal Council, the elephant's ear can easily be moved from inside the barge. So somebody is inside that elephant figure controlling his ears. So honestly, imagine telling someone that that is your job. What do you do? I work on the king's boat. Oh, what exactly do you do there? I move the elephant's ears. I mean, that is one job I don't think you will ever forget. So the king's wife has something similar on her boat. Her barge carries a large bird figure called Nawanje, representing a cattle egg grate, and just like the elephant, his wing can move as well. So now the royal procession has the king's elephant on one boat and the queen's bird on another, and both are moving across the same water, but we are still missing the most important part. Where are they going? So the answer is Limulinga. And once you know that, another question immediately comes up. Why does the king need another royal residence? Why not simply remaining at the Lialu? Why have two royal residences in the first place? So this is where the story takes a turn, because Limulunga isn't just another place the king happens to visit. There's something very important about this location. It is on higher ground and Lialu is not. Now we can finally talk about the thing that makes this whole journey necessary: the water. Lilu sits in the Barotes floodplain, and during the wet season, the water rises across the land. So when it gets to the point where staying at the lower royal residence becomes difficult, the Litunga leaves Lialu and move to Lomolinga, where the ground is higher. That is what Kumboka is about. The word is generally translated as to get out of water, and suddenly the strange journey we have been talking about makes a lot more sense. So the king is not leaving because he wants a change of environment, he's just following the water. So for generations, the people of these regions have lived with the rise and fall of floodplain. They know what the water does, they know the season, and the royal household has to move with those seasons too. But here is where the story gets really interesting. If the king simply needed to move away from rising water, why did this become such a huge ceremony? Why the enormous boat? Why the drums? Why the peddlers? Why the elephants sitting above the boat? Why do thousands of people gather to watch? Because somewhere along the way, something that began as a practical journey became much more than that. It became Kumboka. The boats are prepared, the paddlers take their places, people begin gathering along the water, and eventually the royal procession begins. Imagine standing there that morning. At first, you are just watching the water. Then you notice movements in the distance. So a few boats appear, the scout goes ahead, more boats follows, and then you see it. Then Nalikiwanda, the enormous black and white royal badge. Rows of paddlers are working together. The drums are beating, and above the boat is the elephant. Then you realize you are looking at the Lutinga and his royal household beginning their journey from the Lialo to Lumulinga. And this is not some quick boat ride. The paddlers have hours of work ahead of them, so the movement have to stay together. One person cannot simply paddle whenever e feel like. They have to move as one. And while all of this is happening, the royal procession slowly moves further away from Lialo. People standing along the starting point watch the boats become smaller, smaller and smaller until eventually they disappear into the distance. But the journey isn't over. So the processions keep going towards Lumulinga and eventually the higher grounds comes closer. So the Lutinga arrives, the royal household settle in and the Lialo is left behind for the wet season. Now, there is one important thing to clear up. When people say the king moved his entire palace, they don't mean the actual palace building is packed up and carried away. The two royal residents stay where they are. What moved is the Lutinga and his royal household, his attendants, his court, his possession, people who need to accompany him. So it is really a seasonal movement between the two royal residents. So the large part of the journey is made by paddling. That is a very different kind of moving day. And the people doing the paddling are not just there to make the boats look impressive. Being selected to paddle the Nalikiwanda is an honor. The paddlers wear traditional clothing including scarlet berets and animal skin skirts, and they spend hours moving the royal barge across the water. Without them, the Nalikiwanda is not going anywhere. And then there are drummers. So it all brings the paddler together. Everyone has a role: the paddler, the drummer, the people accompanying the Lutinga, the people gathering along the water, and right in the middle of it all is the king. That is what makes Kumboka so fascinating. You can look at the photograph of the ceremony and immediately see something unusual. A huge black and white boat, a giant elephant, rows of paddlers, a king, crowd gathered beside the water. And once you know why they are there, the picture changes. You understand that the boat is not just a boat, and the journey is not just a journey, and the ceremony is not simply something people put on for visitors. It is connected to the landscape itself. The water rises, the king leaves, the water eventually falls, and the king's return. So the return is associated with another ceremony called Kufulu Ila. So the tradition has two sides. He leaves Lialo for Lumulinga, then when the condition changed, he returns to Lialo, and eventually the circles begins again. The water rises, preparation starts, the Nalikiwanda comes out, the paddlers take their places, the drums begin, and once again the royal household sets off. So that is why the timing of Kumboka isn't simply chosen because a particular date look good on a calendar. So the condition of the floodplains matters a lot. The water has a say in the journey, and I think that is the part that makes this story so remarkable. Because what started as something the royal household genuinely needed to do became something an entire community came to experience together. People don't just see a king moving from one residence to another. They see their history moving across the water. They hear the drums, they watch the paddlers, they see the Nalikwanda appear in the distance, and for few hours the whole landscape becomes part of the ceremony. So when you hear that there is a king in Zambia whose royal household moves between two royal residences every year, it sounds almost unbelievable.